Hey y'all, and welcome to the kitchen. Today we are going to learn a real classic, and that is spaghetti and meatballs, actual real authentic Italian style. Now, I'm born and raised from South Carolina, so obviously I've been taught this by a real deal nonna. This comes from my husband's side of the family. His grandmother and grandfather were part of the crew that were putting the pipeline, the gas pipeline, across the country in the 50s and 60s, and they traveled with a bunch of the workers as they were installing the pipeline. And one of the families that they traveled along with and lived alongside of was a migrant family from northern Italy, and they actually taught my grandmother-in-law how to make these. So this is real deal northern Italian, like a nonna would make it, and so I don't argue with any of these traditions. It turns out perfectly, even though a couple of the things will blow your mind. So here we're starting with about 2.5 pounds of ground beef. You don't have to have this big of a batch, but for us, even if I'm not feeding a big group, I always make this in a double batch so I can put the second half away for another day, and I can just pull my meatballs out of the freezer, put them in my sauce, and they're ready to go. So first things first, I'm going in with my ground beef and off with my rings. I don't want to have to fight with meatballs with my rings on. You'll have to clean those out for a long time later, so I'll put those up in a safe place. Real tip, learned the hard way. Don't put those anywhere you'll forget them, and also don't put them anywhere near a drain. Okay, in with our beef. First thing we're going to do is we're going to crack an egg and get in some parsley, some Parmesan cheese, and some breadcrumbs. So that was 1 egg for this amount. And it was a pretty large egg. If you have a small egg, you probably would need 2 for 2.5 pounds of meat, but that was a very large egg. And then I'm going to go in with 2 tablespoons of garlic. Now this is fresh garlic. This is just fresh minced garlic, and it's going to look like a good little bit, but remember, this is a lot of meatballs. And these are going to cook low and slow for a very long time. And that's part of the process. Okay? The next thing I'm going to do is some breadcrumbs, and we're going to go in with about 1 cup of breadcrumbs. And I've taught my students this before, so y'all have seen this, but I'm going to show you again. This in your hand, when you cup, is about 1/4 of a cup. So if you can go like this, if it's a man hand, it's probably more like 1/2. But for my hand, 1/4 of a cup is my full palm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, another trick I teach and have taught is this. If you do this and that small little cup in the very middle of your hand, that's a tablespoon. So no need to measure that. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is get some parsley. I'm going to break off this is going to be about 1/2 of a cup in your hand to begin with, and chop down it'll end up being about 1/4 of a cup of parsley. You can use dried parsley here, but my preference is the fresh. I've done both. I won't not make this just because I don't have the fresh parsley, but the original recipe is the fresh. If you're using the dried parsley, I wouldn't use nearly as much. I would use more like 1/4 of a cup altogether. Okay, here we go. In with the parsley. And then we're going to go in with some Parmesan cheese. Now you can get the pre-grated, and I've done that before too, but I love when they have these good blocks of Parmesan, especially when they have them on sale. I'm going to pick these every time. So I'm going to go ahead and grate about 1/4 of a cup of Parmesan cheese. And I'm going to use my finer grate here instead of my big grate, just because I want this to really get all throughout my meat mixture and evenly distributed. Every bite has to have some Parmesan cheese in it. Okay, that looks about good. So maybe this is more like 1/2 of a cup. Yeah, it is. Something that you would like to probably know. When I was learning to cook, I'm self-taught. So I have had to go back because I'm teaching people to cook and have taught people how to cook. When it's time for me to teach a recipe, I go back and I have to write down and measure, because when I do it to begin with, guess what? I don't measure. I was taught this 1 or 2 times, and then lo and behold, it's mine and I go for it. Okay, 1/2 a cup Parmesan cheese. Next thing we're going to go in with is a little bit of milk. Now this is something that you're going to want to do a little bit, mix around, see where you're at, and do a little bit more. And that's the beauty of cooking. Sometimes it's perfect, exactly like the recipe says, and sometimes you have to tweak it. So be prepared to know what you're doing and know what you're looking for. So we're going to mix this a little bit and end with some milk. After we do a little bit of mixing, you'll see your breadcrumbs and you'll see your egg and see how much moisture is in your meat. I went in with about 1/4 cup to start, and then you'll know how much moisture you're going to need. It's really about a binding ratio here. So we're just going to start the mixing process. We're not doing the whole thing. We're just going to start and see where we're at. And this is why you don't want your rings on. Okay, so it looks to me like I'm going to need a tiny bit more milk. Not a lot, though. Okay. Okay, honest to goodness, I'm going to need a little bit more milk, and I feel like a little bit more breadcrumbs. So I'm going to wipe my hands off. And I'm going to go in with about another 1/4 cup of breadcrumbs. A lot of times when you're using these bigger packages of meat, you're going to need to do a little bit and then add a little bit more. So another 1/4 cup. And the difference is your fat ratio inside your meat. And then another 1/4 cup of milk, and we should be really good. I am going to go ahead and salt and pepper here before I get my hands in for my big mix, because I don't want to over mix my meatballs. So this is going to be, for this amount, about a tablespoon of salt, because this is 2.5 pounds of meat. And another good teaspoon at least of pepper. If I'm doing fresh cracked pepper like this and I say teaspoon, a good rule of thumb is about 20 cracks. And I'm not counting because I'm talking, so I'm going to do about 3 more and call it a day. Okay, now I think we're actually ready for our big mix now. And I'm not going to mix this and push it together. I'm mixing with an open hand. This is a claw shape. And what we're doing is it's almost like you're combing through it with your fingers to get the mixture portion done. And then we're going to sort of start to meet it together in the middle like a little ball so it can get its flavors married together while we're rolling the meatballs. All right, and just like that, that's how quickly it comes together. You don't, like I said, you don't want to overmix because that'll make you a tough meatball. And this is what it looks like. Yummy, yummy. Smells wonderful. So the next thing I want to do, I'm going to wipe my hand off real quick, and I'm going to spray my pan with some non-stick cooking spray. So in my case, I love to use my avocado oil spray. You can use whatever you have on hand. All right, get all this out of the way, and let's get to mixing. Now the size that I'm going to do here is going to be about between a ping pong ball and a golf ball. And usually for about 2.5 pounds of meat, that'll make somewhere between 35 and 40 meatballs. We'll see how I do. And get my tray up here. And I'm going to get to mixing. Or get to rolling. Okay. Now the part of this that's going to be really one of the things that you're going to be like, huh? And I was too. I was skeptical at first. We are going to put our sauce together, and we are not going to season our tomato sauce at all. So basically how this goes is you put these in the oven. They bake and get crusty on the outside. And then you transfer them to your pot. And once they're in your pot, you're putting all your tomato products on there. And the meatballs are doing the work of seasoning your sauce. It blew my mind. I was like, you're telling me I'm not adding anything to these tomatoes, because it's tomato sauce. It's not marinara sauce. It is tomato sauce. And the low and the slow cooking process does the seasoning for you. So all the flavors that we put in there, the garlic, the Parmesan, the parsley, the salt that's going to come out, the great flavor, the richness from your ground beef, that is what's going to season your sauce. And that's why it is a low and a slow cook, because it needs all of that time for the sauce to really get its flavor. Now, if you are using canned tomatoes, tomato sauce that is no salt added because you need to control your particular salt level, I would say that you probably need to add a tiny little bit of salt to your tomatoes because the tomato sauce that comes in the can already does have a little bit of salt in it at packaging. And if your meatballs are not all the same exact size, it's okay. They're going to cook in the sauce. Like I said, it's not like having cookies and one's going to burn and the other one's not going to cook all the way through. And if you'll notice while I'm rolling these, I'm not mushing them. I'm not compacting them a lot with my hand. This is a two-hand cup shape method. So basically I'm taking one hand like a cup with the meat in it, the other hand like a cup, and I'm doing the rolling around. And there's just a tiniest bit of pressure that gets the shape made, but you're not smashing this together. The less you can handle the meat, the more tender it's going to be, the moisture is going to stay in. Another thing I was going to tell you is when you have meat that has a fat ratio that's higher, the amount that the egg and the milk does to moisten your meat, a little egg and a little milk is going to go a longer way. So if you have leaner meat, say you want to do like a ground turkey, or even if you have a ground beef that's like a 93% meat and only a 7% fat ratio, you're going to need a little bit more moisture in there. So that's a circumstance where you may need a 2-egg situation to have that richness and have that moisture in your meat. Now this sheet pan's probably not going to hold the entirety of what's in here. Well, I'm looking. It may. I've surprised myself before. I do have quite a frequent question here or there. What if I don't want to do ground beef? What if I don't do red meat? And turkey does, or ground chicken, does do fine for this. But like I said, you're just going to have to do a few things here and there to tweak to make sure your seasoning and your moisture make up for the fact that you don't have that full fat red meat flavor. Sometimes if I have a question like that and they're like, I really love the richness and I love the savory of a beef, but I just think I'm not doing beef right now. There is a product called Beef Base, and if you wanted to stir in a tablespoon of beef base to your turkey meatballs, that would help them have a little bit more richness. And that doesn't even add any fat to it. But there's nothing wrong with a little bit of fat. The good kind especially. Okay, no, there's no way they're all going to fit on this. Okay, so this, like I said, is going to make between 35 and 40 meatballs, most likely. And right now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're going to do some math. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have about 30 done. So we're going to probably have to get a little sheet tray, and that's fine, to do our last 10 or so. Now, these are going to go into my oven at 400 degrees, and they're going to cook until they're just brown on the outside. We're going to go for about 15 minutes, and that'll be it. And then they're going to get married with the sauce in my big sauce pot. Okay, I think this is the last one that we're going to fit on here. You don't want them to be like really up against each other. I'll show you what they look like. They want to have a little tiny bit of space. Whoop, sliding around. Because you want them to actually cook instead of steaming each other. Okay, let me get a quick paper towel. Don't want to touch my oven door like this. Okay, and in we go. See if I can do it with my arm. I got it. All right, that's going to cook for about 15 minutes. I'm going to roll the rest of these, and then I'll be right back. Okay guys, it's time to get started on the sauce for our spaghetti and meatballs. So the first thing I'm going to do, I've got all my cans of tomatoes open, including my tomato paste, and this is where we're going to start. So I've got a big pot right here, and I'm going to turn it on about medium-low heat. Now medium-low is where you want your heat for this, because once tomato products get warm, they kind of tend to splatter. So high heat for this is a little bit dangerous and a little bit risky. So we're going to stay medium-low, medium at most, because this is a low and slow process. So first thing I'm going to put in is a little bit of tomato paste. Now tomato paste is a very concentrated tomato flavor. And I'm going to use all of this can of tomato paste. And if you'll notice, the thing I'm using is a butter knife, and that is on purpose. There's a method for getting tomato paste out without just like driving yourself nuts trying to scoop it. You take your knife and you circle the exterior of the can. And what you're going to find is all of that is going to come out just like that onto your knife, and the interior of the can is going to be almost totally clean. If you go in with a spoon, it just doesn't get it all as easily. So that's my trick for tomato paste, a butter knife. Okay, that's it. Now the reason that we're going to start with tomato paste over tomato sauce is we've talked before about herbs that are dried needing to wake up in the pan. So this is the similar thing. These are very concentrated canned tomato flavors. And the tomato paste specifically needs to get in contact with the bottom of the pan so it can start to get some really good heat on it and wake the flavor up. So it goes in first, and I'm going to add in the rest of our tomatoes in just a second. But after that, I'm going to add in 3 waters that are the tomato paste can size of this amount to put into our tomato paste. And this is just going to take your tomato paste and give it sort of a tomato sauce consistency. And it's going to give it some room to move. It's just the way the recipe goes. I didn't ask questions about this part either. Honest to goodness, by the time I got the recipe, the Northern Italian woman taught my grandmother-in-law, Richard's granny taught my mother-in-law, and my mother-in-law taught me. So who am I going to ask a question? We just have to do what they said to make it taste right. So that is 1 can of tomato paste in first with 3 cans of water. And we're just going to stir this around a little bit and get it good and happy. Let me see. I want a bigger spoon than that. Let's get a big spoon. Here we go. Now, we're going to give a wooden spoon, stir, and this is really, like I said, waking up the flavor. It's getting the heat, touching the tomato paste, getting the tomato paste broken down in that water so it's not in big, big chunks. And then the next thing we're going to do is go in with our 3 big cans of tomatoes. Now these tomato sauce are totally pureed. There's no pulp in them. These are as smooth can be, and that's what you want. So we're going to go in for this is 2.5 pounds of meat, the amount of sauce that you want. These are 29-ounce cans, 3 of them to 1 whole can of tomato paste with water in it. Now I'm going to pop the lid a little bit more, and be careful. This could splash. You definitely don't want to do this in a hurry. We're going to get our tomatoes in here, and I'm going to show you at the end. There's going to be a lot of tomato just left in the bottom. I always do a couple of tablespoons of water in the bottom each of my canned tomatoes to make sure I'm getting everything out. Because you paid for that tomato sauce. You don't want to waste it. And this is actually going to reduce for so long that all of the water that you may add to get your tomatoes out, that's going to evaporate into the air, and your tomato flavor is going to be even more concentrated. Okay, last one. And the same thing is true when I use a jar of spaghetti sauce or marinara that's pre-made. I take my sauce, I put a few drops of water in there, shake it around with my lid on. In this case, I'm going to just do a little swirl because this lid doesn't go all the way back on. But if it's a jar, the lid goes right back on. Shake it, and get the last of whatever's in there out. Don't waste. That's good stuff. Somebody worked hard to grow those tomatoes, and you paid good money for them. Okay, so that's enough water for that one and this one. So we're going to go this can, a little swirl, into this can, a little swirl. And then in just a second, my meatballs are going to be ready to go in. The reason that you want to do your meatballs in the oven first is when you do them in a pan, they can be a little bit hard to flip and get evenly browned on all the sides without breaking them apart and messing up the shape and all that kind of stuff. So just to prevent all that extra flipping and turning and risky break-in business, I love to do mine just right in the oven. And you'll see that when I take them out, they're going to have a little bit of their drippings on the pan. You're going to want to put most of that into the sauce because that will season your sauce. Like I said, this sauce is going to be seasoned by the meatballs themselves. So whatever they leaked off out onto that pan, that's going to be seasoning for your sauce. So my first little batch is coming out, oh, perfectly brown. And just a reminder, we did that on 400 degrees, and we did it for about 15 minutes. Now, I'm going to take my meatballs and gently off of the pan lower them into my tomato sauce. And at the end, that's when I'll get in and transfer some of the flavor from the bottom of the pan. You don't have to put in all of it, because honest to goodness, you know, fat is flavor, and what's on the bottom of that pan is flavorful fat. So you don't have to use all of it, but I certainly wouldn't discard every bit. Now, I will say this. Sometimes we have this spaghetti and meatballs, and we have people that are huge meatball fans, and they'll make a plate with 4 meatballs on it. And then sometimes we'll have some people that are like, I want a meatball and mostly sauce. So you're going to have to see for your family how much sauce they use. I have been known to get to my pot of meatballs after my family has eaten it and see that there is a lot of meatballs left and not as much sauce. So if we want to have the leftovers another night, all you have to do is take an additional can of tomato sauce, put it over your meatballs that have already cooked for a little while, and in about 30 to 45 minutes of a low simmer, the additional can of tomatoes will have appropriately been seasoned, and you will have another batch of spaghetti and meatballs without having to start completely over. One thing I do love about cooking is usually there's more than one way to do things, and almost always there are ways to stretch. Okay, so now I'm going to put in about half of this yummy, yummy liquid, and it's just beef fat and seasonings. Just a little bit of it. Because if we don't have that fat and flavor in there, then our sauce isn't going to coat our pasta as good as it could, and all of that oil from our beef fat is going to just give that luscious mouthfeel that you get on your noodle. Okay, I'm stirring that around. And remember, we had a second pan that went in a few minutes later. So in a minute, I'm going to take out that second pan of meatballs, put them in here, and I'm going to simmer this on low for about 2 hours. If you needed to do this in a crock pot, at this point, you could put your crock pot on low, 6 to 8 hours, and it would be good all day. You could put it on high for 3 to 4, and it would be perfect. So if you want to do this in a crock pot setting, that works perfectly after the meatballs have completely been done and into the sauce they have gone. So after I get those out, I will put a lid on this, and I will look at it every 20 to 30 minutes, give it a little stir, make sure it doesn't need to have any water added, because the only reason you would see that it needed water is if it was getting a little bit too thick and not saucy enough earlier in the cooking process. So as we sit right here, I'm going to wait for my other 10 meatballs to come out, put them into my sauce, lid on, and cook for 2 hours. I'll show you what it looks like when we're all finished.